It's April 1945. In the final days of World War II, American soldiers race against time to reach a tiny town in Czechoslovakia before the Soviets get there. On paper, the place has no value. No forts, no factories, no landmarks. So why risk lives? Because this is a rescue mission. Not for people, but for horses. The legendary Lipizzaner. And what's even stranger about this mission? To rescue them from the advancing Soviets, bitter enemies, Americans and Germans, join forces and fight side by side. This is the true story of Operation Cowboy. By the end of April 1945, the Second World War was reaching its violent end. Hitler's Third Reich was collapsing, cities were burning, and armies were closing in from all sides, Soviets from the east and Allies from the west. Just a few kilometers from the front lines stood the hostile stud farm, a sprawling ranch that had become the centerpiece of the Nazis' grand experiment in animal breeding. Here, some of the most prized horses in Europe were gathered: Lipizzaners, Arabians, and Thoroughbreds. These horses were the Nazis' attempt to engineer a pure master race of horses, just as they had dreamed of doing with humans. The Lipizzaners in particular were no ordinary horses. Bred for centuries by the Habsburg monarchy of Austria, they were famed for their elegance, intelligence, and ability to perform highly trained maneuvers. White-coated and regal in appearance, they had become living symbols of aristocracy and imperial grandeur. To the Nazis, obsessed with racial purity, the Lipizzaners were more than just horses. They were symbols of purity, the foundation of a so-called Aryan master breed fit for their empire. But as the Soviet Red Army marched west, fear spread quickly. The Germans knew exactly what was at stake. If the Soviets captured the horses, they would not hesitate to slaughter them for food, just as they had done in Hungary, where they wiped out the entire Royal Hungarian Lipizzaner collection. Many of the horses were simply shot, while others were forced into harnesses, pulling wagons like common workhorses. The war was ending, but for the horses of Hostau, the greatest danger was only just beginning. And now, the responsibility for their fate rested on the shoulders of two German officers: Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Rudowski, the German commander at the farm, and Dr. Rudolf Lessing, the farm's veterinarian. Both men knew that the Nazi leadership would never permit them to make contact with Americans. In fact, they could be executed for simply proposing it. So, to save these magnificent creatures, they would have to attempt the unthinkable: go against the Nazi regime and strike a secret deal with their enemies in the middle of the war. Soon, Dr. Lessing made contact with the US 2nd Cavalry Group, a mechanized reconnaissance unit stationed in Bavaria, right at the border of Czechoslovakia. These were no ordinary soldiers. They were horsemen at heart, many having served in mounted units before mechanization. The commander was Colonel Charles H. Reed, a man who, like the Germans, understood the cultural and historical value of the Lipizzaners. Reed was already aware that the prized horses were being held in Hostau, thanks to another German Luftwaffe intelligence officer, Lieutenant Colonel Walter Halters, who had surrendered to the Americans days earlier. He knew that if the Soviets reached the farm before his men did, the Lipizzaners and every other horse there would be lost forever. But launching a mission inside Czechoslovakia was extremely risky. Under agreements made at the Yalta Conference, Czechoslovakia was to fall within the Soviet sphere of influence. An American operation there could provoke conflict with the advancing Red Army. Reed wasted no time and took the request up the chain, eventually reaching General George S. Patton, commander of the US Third Army. Patton, a lifelong horseman and former Olympian equestrian, didn't need convincing. The idea of saving Europe's most legendary horses appealed not only to his military instincts, but also to his personal passion. He sanctioned a small force for the operation and issued a single, clear directive: make it fast. With that, the stage was set. The Germans and Americans, enemies only days before, were about to fight side by side in one of the most extraordinary rescue missions of the war. With Patton's approval, the mission was a go. Assigned to the operation were 2 small cavalry reconnaissance troops, equipped with M8 scout cars, a handful of M8 howitzer motor carriages, and 2 M24 Chaffee light tanks. Supporting them was a screening infantry force of 325 men. The task force was placed under the command of Major Robert P. Andrews. They anticipated fierce resistance from the thousands of German troops still holding the region, including armoured divisions such as the feared 11th Panzer Division. An artillery barrage by the 11 Corps helped suppress potential opposition, clearing the way for the advancing task force. After tense hours of manoeuvring, the Americans finally reached the hostile stud farm. At the farm, they were received by Rudovsky, who had been anxiously awaiting the arrival of American forces to assist in the rescue of the horses. But the danger was not yet over. Small groups of SS soldiers continued to launch attacks on the farm. The Americans responded with coordinated fire, repelling each assault and inflicting heavy losses on the SS. Once the immediate threat was neutralized, the real challenge began. The farm was home to hundreds of horses, including pregnant mares and delicate foals just 2 to 4 weeks old. The Americans faced an overwhelming problem. The number of animals far outnumbered the men, and moving them all safely while under the looming threat of both the Red Army and the remaining Nazi units required extraordinary effort and coordination. Andrews turned to the freed Allied prisoners of war at the farm for help. British, New Zealanders, French, Poles, and Serbs, men who had only just been liberated, joined the effort. They calmed frightened horses, loaded supplies, and prepared the herds for the journey. He also accepted help from a small group of Russian anti-communist Cossack cavalry who had been fighting Soviets and happened to be in the area. Seasoned horsemen, their mastery of mounted tactics proved invaluable as they guided the herds with whips and reins, steadying even the most skittish animals. The foals and pregnant mares were loaded into trucks, while the remaining horses were herded into makeshift columns. At the last moment, just as the preparations were complete, Russian tanks appeared on the horizon. But in these last moments of war, they avoided confrontation, allowing the Americans and their fellow rescuers to evacuate. By the time the last horse crossed into American-controlled territory, Operation Cowboy had defied impossible odds. Former enemies had fought side by side, and men had risked everything in the dying days of the war to preserve a legacy that might otherwise have been lost forever. What do you think of this daring rescue? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more interesting stories from our past. And as always, thanks for watching.